Germany's main intelligence service, the BND, is in crisis. It's been publicly criticised by the Chancellor, the deputy-Chancellor, and two of its former chiefs over a failure to see the war in Ukraine coming. On top of all that, the BND appears to have Russian agents inside it. Are German spies fit for purpose? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Germany's BND intelligence service has had to get used to public criticism after it failed to predict the war in Ukraine when other Western agencies had. The service was caught so cold by events that BND head Bruno Kahl was actually trapped in Kyiv. And if that wasn't humiliating enough, it appears to be riddled with traitors.
Moscow's attack on Ukraine exposed dysfunction at the highest levels of the BND, the only German spy agency able to operate abroad. It has missed much. An intelligence officer known as Carsten L. has been charged with treason and could face life in prison for passing state and, by definition, NATO secrets to Russia for money. A German businessman known as Arthur E. was arrested back in January, also for allegedly spying for the Kremlin, and is also charged with treason. And in August, a government official known as Thomas H., who worked for an office that deals with military equipment, was arrested on suspicion for spying too. If the BND can't spot era-defining conflicts on its doorstep and Russian spies at home, what can it do?
Well, let's meet our guests in Berlin. Ulrich Brueckner, a political analyst in Germany. In Surrey, in the United Kingdom, we have Martin Smith, a senior lecturer in defence and international affairs at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. And in Brussels, we have Edward Hunter Christie, who's a former NATO official. I'll come to you first, Ulrich. When we think of foreign intelligence agencies, we think of sharp, shrewd people in well-run, and when they have to be, ruthless organisations. Is it fair to say that the BND is none of these things?
Well, it's definitely fair to say this. And the BND is also in a long-lasting phase of reconstruction. They just moved in right before COVID into a brand new building in Berlin. Before, they were hiding in the woods in the south of Bavaria, and no one really paid attention to them because on the one hand, what they do is secret. And on the other hand, there weren't major scandals that put them in the spotlight. So people don't really pay attention to what they do. And now that they are in Berlin and we see a few headlines, some people might be concerned, but it's still not a major public debate about what is the BND and how do they operate.
But perhaps a lazy stereotype, Ulrich. When people think of Germany and Germans, the one word that would always pop up is efficiency. Very efficient organisations. This seems to be systemic over many years.
Yeah, on the one hand, it's true. People are very much into, there is a certain natural order of things, and the rule of law is something that you find everywhere, which partly leads to something like a form of overregulation. And that's the opposite of why people who are interested in espionage or in James Bond movies expect that something like an external service that is kind of above the law is fascinating, because James Bond has the right to do things that other citizens are not allowed to do. While in the case of Germany, we come from a history of two totalitarian systems. And that means that whatever operates in Germany is strictly bound to the rule of law and a very tight set of rules and regulations. And that is exactly the opposite of what you need to do if you operate in the dark and if you have to hunt the bad guys.
Martin, do you think it's fair to say that Germany's dark past perhaps casts a long shadow over the BND and what they can actually achieve?
I think so. I think any state's intelligence services and intelligence agencies are almost bound to be influenced by historical and cultural considerations, and in particular, how they feed into that state and wider society's view of itself and the role that it ought to be trying to play in the contemporary world, in the contemporary international arena. And I think an important point about intelligence is there is, I think, by definition, always going to be an ambiguous relationship between, if you like, the producers of intelligence, the intelligence services and intelligence agencies, and the consumers of intelligence, i.e. the politicians, the decision makers. So intelligence and the collection of intelligence and attitudes towards what intelligence agencies can and cannot do are inevitably in Germany and elsewhere going to be shaped by historical and cultural considerations, but also impacted by contemporary worldviews and domestic political considerations as well.
Edward, are you surprised at just how poorly performing the BND has been for several years now?
I'm not especially surprised. I mean, I don't want to knock the BND colleagues too hard, but to very much agree with the other two guests. My experience of that, and when I was a NATO official, I took part in various conferences and meetings in which several agencies from several allied countries were making presentations, for example. So I've been exposed to the differences and the contrasts between different agencies from different allied countries. And it always struck me, or it struck me then, let's say, that an intelligence agency can never be separated from its national context. The other guests mentioned history, of course, but I would say in the broader sense, the strategic culture of the country in question. And especially in our nations, we are all democratic nations, we have political control of the intelligence agencies. And so to take a very well-known or notorious formulation, the concept of deep state, my experience is that there is no such thing as a deep state in democratic countries. On the contrary, intelligence agencies really are controlled by the political masters. And to take the analogy of Martin, or the relationship between producers and consumers, the fact is that in any national context, if the political masters really, really don't want to hear something from their intelligence briefings, this could translate into pressure onto a service to either exaggerate something or minimize something or not look into something. And I suspect that Germany has had its own type of problem with that, especially post-reunification.
Ulrich, if we look at the issue of Ukraine and Russia, the BND did not think Putin would invade Ukraine. He did. They then predicted that all of Ukraine would be occupied by Russian troops within 24 hours. That didn't happen. And then its president, Bruno Kahl, ended up stuck in Kyiv and had to be extricated from the Ukrainian capital. I mean, how did they possibly get all of that so wrong?
Well, if you could give me the counterexample of an intelligence that knew exactly what happened, then we can discuss what are the main differences. But as the other guests have already highlighted, Germany had a reputation of a very powerful security apparatus. Gestapo was known for knowing so much more, but the very high price of the history of Gestapo and Stasi is that people are very, very sensitive about what we allow the state and the state authorities to do, and to what extent do we restrict voluntarily what secret units are supposed to do, because it's a complicated balance of power between to what extent do we sacrifice freedom rights for the sake of having the perfect picture of what is happening, or to increase security a bit. And in that respect, Germany is definitely different from countries that are strictly driven by effectiveness.
But Ulrich, there's a big difference between knowing what's going on in your own country and your own people and knowing that a country on your doorstep, the size of Russia, is about to invade another European country. They should have seen that coming, shouldn't they?
I don't know. As I said, I haven't heard of other intelligence units that were so much better prepared. I served in the German armed forces, so the moment I heard that blood reserves are transported to the border, it was clear that something is happening in which you do something different from just a normal drill or a normal operation which you're not planning to invade. So this doesn't need intelligence, then you just connect the dots and you know what's happening. Everyone was convinced that the second largest nuclear arsenal and Putin's experience with wars in different parts of the world would be such an asymmetric situation compared with what Ukraine could put on the ground, that the likeliness that something is happening, like a scenario in which Russia would invade the whole country instantly, is far more likely than what we now see 1.5 years later. So I don't know if this is something that just by increasing the amount of resources or to allow technological use to extend to limits that are currently restrictive for the BND would have led to a very different result. I don't think that the other Western intelligence agencies have done a much better job than the BND in that respect.
Martin, would you disagree with that?
I think I would disagree with that in the specific context of Ukraine, because the US and the British intelligence agencies were very clear in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine that this is what Mr. Putin was planning to do, and they were also very public. Relatively speaking, or were allowed to go public by the political authorities, particularly the Biden administration in the United States. If I could just mention a couple of points of context in mitigation to the German experience, perhaps. Number one, I think that there was a semi-successful example of a Russian deception campaign, because the buildup of troops in the vicinity of Ukraine in late 2021, early 2022 was not the first. There'd been a similar large-scale buildup in the spring of 2021. And when questioned about it, Russian spokespeople had said it's a regular exercise. Ukraine is a sensitive area. It's close to NATO. We're a sovereign state. We have the right to exercise and to deploy our troops wherever and however we want on our own territory. And then when the exercise was over, the troops, most of them, were dispersed back to their usual bases. So when it happened again in autumn 2021, understandably, one might argue, the Russian cover story was the same. Nothing to worry about. This is an exercise. We harbor no aggressive intent against our neighbor. It's understandable that, based on previous recent experience, some analysts would be taken in by that argument. The second point, very quickly, if I may, is I think the fact that US intelligence agencies and the US government was being so certain in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, correctly as it turned out, but I think that perhaps awakened memories of the Iraq experience in 2002, 2003, where there was at least the same degree of certainty on the part of American leaders, the George W. Bush administration, citing as a central part of their argument intelligence information about Saddam Hussein's alleged development of WMD programs. And Germany, of course, at the time was on the opposite side of the argument to the United States. And the American argument about WMD, as was subsequently shown, turned out to be dead wrong. So I think, again, there is historical legacy in play when you're talking specifically about intra-NATO intelligence relations, and particularly how other states and governments respond to intelligence certainty coming from the United States.
Just on the issue of Russia, I want to read to you a quote from John Cipher, who is a former CIA officer based in Moscow. This is a recent interview with the Financial Times newspaper in London. We'll take a look at what he said now. He said, "For too many years, German security services arrogantly thought they understood Russia, while at the same time, the Russian services were stealing them blind. Edward, what do you make of that, given that we now know that there have been arrests of alleged Russian spies working for the BND? I mean, had Cypher got a very valid point here?
Yes, I would generally agree with Cypher, and I think he's a good commentator to follow, because he's actually worked inside an intelligence service, which is more than most people can say. I think that the problem with Germany specifically was systemic, and in a different kind of way, France had a similar problem. And for context, Eastern European countries did not have that problem. And essentially, it is a problem of understanding the strategic culture of Russia. Germany essentially allowed itself to be fooled because it was not pessimistic enough in how it was assessing what information it did get from Russia. It was also excessively suspicious, as Martin said, with respect to information coming from the United States, although that was rather self-serving in a way, because a deeper analysis would have revealed that while the George W. Bush administration was very hawkish and wanted to do something with respect to Iraq, that was obvious, so there was a risk they would be bending the intelligence. There was no reason at all to suspect that Biden wanted a war to happen in Eastern Europe. On the contrary, and so this suspicion towards U.S. intelligence was not warranted, and the Germans should not have had it, and the French should not have had it either. And I would also add that it's not only the comparison with the U.S. I think the Baltic allies, who are very small, but they have learned from painful historical experience to be very suspicious of Russia, and they know how to analyze it. They know how to analyze Russian statecraft. They also very quickly believed U.S. warnings, and they had some intelligence of their own which corroborated what the Five Eyes nations knew. So I would broadly agree, yes, with the critique of Cypher. I think at a broader strategic level, Germany went too far in wanting to engage with Russia post-1990. There was just too much engagement at the level of various elites, political, business, and otherwise. And there was a certain naivety in the air, which I suspect affected many layers of German society.
Ulrich, how have the arrests been perceived by the German public? I mean, you've got a very senior, trusted BND employee who directly oversaw their surveillance operations, and he stands accused of handing sensitive German state secrets to Russian agents. How has this gone down in Germany?
Well, as far as I observed it, it didn't cause a major outcry in the German public, because it was not necessarily a success of effective Russian recruitment, but he offered the service as a personal initiative. There are people in Germany who even demonstrated in favor of Russia because they believe Russia has been treated unfairly since the 1990s and NATO shouldn't have expanded further east, while it was actually not NATO expanding, but other countries applying for membership to NATO, which is different from this idea of NATO is a cancer cell that increases and can't wait to invade one day Russia. But coming back to what my colleagues just said, I think it's not helpful if we just play ping pong in terms of Germany did not see this coming and others did something else coming. What we see in the examples that were mentioned, like the Baltic states being almost paranoid about anything that comes from Russia, and so they see what they want to see. George W. Bush wanted to invade Iraq, so he strongly believed that there are weapons of mass destruction. And Germany has a long history of good relations with Russia since Willy Brandt in the 1970s. So this idea of reaching out and engaging economically, and that could lead to a peaceful form of interdependence as we practice within the European Union. This was a form of wishful thinking that we can also apply on other forms of dependency, like with the United States when it comes to security, or with China when it comes to supply chain management. And that can also be called equally naive. It works until it doesn't, and then it's easy in retrospection to say, well, look at these stupid Germans, they didn't get their analysis right.
Martin, can I just ask you, is it always the case that rival countries will always be trying to embed spies in their different intelligence agencies? I mean, the British, going back 70 plus years, had huge problems with Russian spies who were actually British.
I think so. I think that's an inescapable fact of intelligence life. And I think the intelligence agencies and their leaders are very aware of this. They're aware that it's happening. They're aware that probably, desirable though it may be, they're not likely to be able to eliminate the problem entirely. So they take what measures they can to detect potential examples of infiltration, and to hold information as close as they reasonably can within a small select group to try to prevent it falling into the hands of potential infiltrators. The problem there is sometimes if information is too tightly and too closely held and not subject to sufficiently widespread and rigorous internal evaluation and analysis, that can sometimes lead to problems that the intelligence is insufficiently robust and insufficiently well sourced, but nonetheless it can still be taken up by the politicians and used in order to shape and influence policy. And this is what, again, going back to the example of the Bush administration with regard to Iraq, this is one of the arguments that is made as to why the relationship, the ideal relationship between the intelligence agencies in the United States and the political establishment, why that broke down effectively, is that this kind of thing happened, that information on Iraq was considered to be so politically sensitive, so politically important, that it was seized and was taken up. It wasn't subject necessarily to the kind of rigorous internal evaluation and criticism that other intelligence information would have been in the ordinary course of events.
If we were to look at solutions, or you were asked, say, to consult or advise the leadership of the BND, what step change would you like to see, or what kind of progress would you like their leadership to start implementing now?
I think the most important change would be not at the level of the BND, but at the level of the political class, at the level of those who are currently or who will become a Chancellor, Deputy-Chancellor, Minister of Defense, etc. So the political leadership. Essentially, our political classes, whether it's the German one or those of any other Western country, we have to have politicians who are capable of accepting a briefing that spells nightmare scenarios. It has to be possible for our intelligence services to entertain worst-case scenarios and present them to the political leadership and to warn them adequately. It's sometimes, a question of having a sufficiently suspicious, not paranoid, but sufficiently suspicious mind, and that is what intelligence services are for. So to bounce off what Martin was saying earlier about things that work until they don't, in order to avoid having bad surprises, our political leaders have to be cognizant of the fact that, what will we do if something blows up in the Indo-Pacific? What would we do if China invades Taiwan? What would we do if Russia launches a second war of aggression against yet another neighbor, etc.? So I think that's the main change in mentality, that we have to allow the intelligence services to, if you like, analyze unencumbered.
Ulrich, the last word goes to you. Is that a good assessment, really, that German politicians need to be doing more and contributing more and understanding more, and that it's not so much a failure inside the BND as a failure of politicians in your country?
All Western intelligence services performed very badly in Afghanistan, and the United States performed badly in the 2000s. The consequence was that they massively invested, especially in their technological ability to make better analysis and forecasts. But this is something politicians don't even understand. We are talking about mid-age or old politicians who grew up in a different technological time. They have no idea what happened even after everything Edward Snowden explained to us. What is the current level of what intelligence can technically do? And I don't feel any better knowing that the United States can technically do whatever they want to screen a single person, no matter if it's within the United States or elsewhere. That doesn't necessarily make the world safer or make me feel better, because there is a reason why we have human rights. And this is states go too far in certain cases and violate their power and affect individual freedom rights. And I think this should also always been taken into consideration when we think about the effectiveness of services.
Ulrich, vielen Danke to you. Martin, Edward, thank you both, gentlemen, for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here on Roundtable, thank you for watching.